The 18th of December, 1972. Hanoi. The night sky isn't dark. It pulses. Above the blackened cityscape, streaks of fire carve violent arcs through the air. Anti-aircraft tracers ripple like red rivers. The distant whoop of sirens merges with the static hum of radar rooms deep below ground. But the men, staring at Soviet-built radar screens, aren't moving. They're frozen, not from indecision, but from disbelief. B-52 seconds are coming again. In the last 24 hours, over 100 surface-to-air missiles have been fired. Their launchers glowed red-hot from overuse. Missile techs haven't slept. Soviet advisors embedded in the North Vietnamese SAM command chain have warned that this cannot last either for the missile supply chain or for the American crews flying into this storm of metal and fire. But here they are, high above the city, lumbering in formation. Bomb bay doors open. The B-52 stratofortresses, the airborne fortresses that defined American Cold War bombing doctrine, are not supposed to survive this kind of gauntlet. Every Soviet tactical model predicts massive losses at this intensity, at this concentration of radar-guided firepower. Instead, the B-52 seconds fly through. Again. The radar techs scream coordinates. Guidance channels engage. Dozens of missiles launch in tight succession. The sky flashes with interception attempts. For a moment, it looks like nothing could survive. But then an infrared bloom. Bombs fall. Somewhere in downtown Hanoi, the ground shudders, and the radar screens confirm it. Multiple bombers got through. A few disappear from the screen, possibly downed. But most don't. Most survive the run, peel away, and vanish west toward Thailand. In the bunker, a Soviet advisor slams a binder shut. He turns to his Vietnamese counterpart and mutters in Russian, barely audible, "This is not how this was supposed to work." It wasn't just an attack. It was a message. The United States had committed its most valuable bombers, its nuclear-era relics, to a brutal, focused, conventional campaign. And those bombers, backed by electronic warfare, formation tactics, and sheer crew resilience, for the Soviets, this was worse than defeat. It was disbelief. Because as far as their doctrine was concerned, B-52 seconds weren't supposed to survive 1,000 SAM launches. And the most terrifying part? They weren't done yet. From the earliest years of Cold War planning, the Soviet Union's approach to air defense was rooted in mathematical certainty. Radar coverage, missile ranges, engagement envelopes, all plotted with clinical precision. If a strategic bomber penetrated the airspace, the calculations were simple. Detect, lock, launch, destroy. By the 1,960 seconds, the centerpiece of this system was the SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile. With a maximum engagement range of over 30 kilometers and a warhead designed to obliterate high-altitude intruders, it was the weapon Moscow believed would render strategic bombing obsolete. And on paper, it did. Soviet doctrine assumed that a wall of radar-directed SA-2 seconds, deployed in overlapping belts, would destroy, or at least severely degrade, any bomber formation entering its kill zone. Each SA-2 battery operated under centralized command, networked with search radars and fire control systems capable of guiding multiple missiles toward a single aircraft. Saturation would force bomber streams to break formation, lose mutual support, and fall victim to successive waves of interception. The assumption was clean, cold, and deeply flawed. It didn't account for American adaptability. In particular, it ignored the vast difference between hardware parity and doctrinal evolution. The B-52 wasn't flying into Vietnam alone. It came as part of an integrated strike ecosystem escorted by jammers, preceded by wild weasels, and embedded in formations that compensated for losses in real time. But Soviet analysts, steeped in models based on World War II attrition and Korean War patterns, believed in a simple equation: SAM launches equals bomber kills. So, when Operation Linebacker II began on the 18th of December, 1972, they fully expected the campaign to last a day or two, at most. Instead, They watched in disbelief as formation after formation of B-52 seconds not only survived but completed their bombing runs and returned to base. The kill ratios didn't make sense. Out of the first wave of more than 80 bombers, only 3 were downed on opening night. That figure was unacceptable by Soviet standards given the density of SA-2 coverage in Hanoi. The expected figure was 30% attrition per wave. Yet the Americans absorbed the losses and pressed forward without blinking. Soviet advisors in Hanoi began adjusting their own data mid-campaign. Some accused North Vietnamese operators of improper calibration. Others suggested radar jamming was stronger than expected. But a more alarming realization was growing. Perhaps the flaw wasn't in the missiles or the Vietnamese operators, but in the very theory behind saturation, air defense itself, AUS. General once summarized his view of Soviet missile theory in a single sentence. They thought we'd scatter under fire. We trained to fly through hell. That mindset, resilience over panic, coordination over chaos, was the one variable Soviet doctrine had never properly accounted for. And now, the wrong assumptions were unraveling in real time. The Soviet Union had never intended to fight a war of attrition in the skies. Its entire concept of air defense revolved around decisive, overwhelming firepower, one that could turn the air into a no-man's land for high-altitude bombers. In their war rooms, generals spoke confidently of a saturation threshold. Launch enough missiles, and even the most heavily armed bomber stream would collapse. The theory was seductive and wrong. At its core was a belief that missile volume alone could replace strategic flexibility. When dozens of SA-2 seconds were fired in succession, they believed no amount of evasive flying or electronic deception could save the target. Radar locks were assumed to be absolute. Fire control, though centralized, was treated as unbreakable. But in practice, the B-52 seconds shattered this fantasy. Each bomber wasn't just flying high and heavy. It was part of a meticulously crafted machine. They flew in tight combat boxes, electronic warfare pods humming, tail gunners ready, flanked by ECM-equipped aircraft. And crucially, they did not scatter. They did not break. They absorbed missile launches with shocking calm, trusting their jamming corridors and mutual spacing to shield the formation as a whole. This resilience didn't just defy missile math. It violated the very logic of Soviet strategic planning. Worse, it exposed the brittleness of centralized SAM control. The North Vietnamese, trained and equipped by Soviet doctrine, had their SAM sites hardwired into rigid engagement protocols. But B-52 operations exploited every weakness. The Americans staggered their entry vectors. They blanketed the electromagnetic spectrum with decoys and jamming signals. They deployed chaff corridors in synchrony with formation turns. They even used timing deception, delivering real strikes minutes after feints, forcing defenders to waste precious missiles. By day 3 of Linebacker II, a dangerous contradiction emerged. Soviet-designed air defense systems were doing exactly what they had been programmed to do, and still failing. Some SAM batteries fired 30 or more missiles in a single night, often with 0 kills to show for it. Radar operators reported ghost targets, lock failures, and unexplained missile misses. Commanders began rotating batteries to reduce burnout, but morale dipped fast. The system wasn't breaking due to technical failure, it was doctrinal obsolescence in motion. Soviet advisors scrambled to preserve the narrative. They requested tighter engagement zones, broader missile dispersal patterns, even direct Soviet oversight of radar analysis. None of it worked, because the doctrine itself had met its match. Back in Moscow, senior strategists reviewing early Linebacker II data grew uneasy. The question they couldn't answer yet couldn't ignore was simple. What happens when your saturation strategy meets a target that refuses to saturate? For decades, the Soviets had imagined the B-52 as a lumbering Cold War relic. Easy to detect, easy to destroy, impossible to miss. Now they were watching that relic tear through 1,000 missiles in 11 days. And doctrine? Doctrine was bleeding out in silence. The 20th of December, 1972, 2 nights into Linebacker II. The Vietnamese sky is alight again. But something is different tonight. The Soviets are watching closely, this time from a hardened command post outside Hanoi, where a small team of senior advisors have arrived to observe the missile belts in action. A full wave of B-52Ds, callsign Brown 03 flight, has just crossed into the engagement zone. They're on final approach for a coordinated strike on the Hanoi rail yards. Intelligence has tipped the defenders off. The entire SAM grid has been set to maximum alert. At least 40 missiles are queued. The plan is brutal in its simplicity. Unleash every available SA-2 inches, a layered barrage, the moment the bombers come into range. Saturation will do what doctrine promises. The launch order is given. What follows is a storm. Missile after missile roars into the sky. The control room trembles from the successive ignitions. Soviet advisors watch their instruments flood with data guidance locks, radar elevation spikes, warhead proximity triggers. Dozens of contrails split the clouds above Hanoi. This is the very definition of saturation fire. But something doesn't add up. As the minutes tick by, only a single B-52 drops off radar. 2 more show erratic patterns, possibly hit. But the others, most of the formation, maintains speed, altitude, heading. And then the moment comes. From inside the clouds, through the haze of chaff and ECM distortion, the telltale thump of dozens of 750-pound bombs. The entire Hanoi marshalling yard is hit. Flames bloom across rail lines, fuel tanks, and warehouses. Ground spotters report full impact. It's not just a partial strike. It's total mission success. The Soviet advisors are stunned. One whispers that perhaps the SAM fuses failed. Another mutters something about jamming interference. But neither explanation survives long. In the post-strike analysis, it becomes clear nearly all missiles launched correctly. Their guidance systems worked. Their proximity fuses were armed. Yet, they missed. Why? Because the B-52 seconds weren't reacting like targets. They were flying like weapons. Formation spacing had shifted dynamically mid-flight to avoid saturation overlap. Jammers had cut through radar lock just before the launch window, breaking hard locks at the most critical second. Chaff corridors were layered so deep that at least 3 SAMs hit nothing but tinfoil. This wasn't blind luck. It was deliberate adaptation. A living, learning machine in the sky, adjusting in real time, surviving a kill zone built to annihilate it. For the first time, Soviet advisors considered a possibility more unsettling than tactical error: that their entire SAM network had been gamed. A missile officer in the Hanoi bunker stared at the surviving radar tracks, then turned to the Soviet colonel and asked flatly, "What do we do if this keeps happening?" The colonel didn't answer, because no one had prepared for this outcome, not in the manuals, not in the war games, and not in Moscow's most classified missile doctrine. And yet the B-52 seconds kept flying. By the 22nd of December, 1972, the reports pouring into Soviet Air Defense Command in Moscow read like fragments from a malfunctioning system. Data points with no pattern, outcomes with no cause. Senior generals pored over intercepted communications, launch logs, and radar records from their North Vietnamese counterparts. And none of it made sense. According to Soviet theory, the Hanoi missile belt was dense enough to be impenetrable. Overlapping SA-2 sites had been carefully positioned to create no-fly zones, stretching from the capital to Haiphong. With nearly every radar operating at peak capacity and over 1,000 missiles stockpiled in hardened bunkers, the defenses were supposed to overwhelm even the most determined assault. Instead, Moscow was facing a statistical nightmare. Hundreds of B-52 sorties had entered the envelope. Over 1,000 missiles had been fired. And yet the American bombers were not only getting through but hitting their targets with terrifying accuracy. Loss rates? Lower than expected. ECM interference? Stronger than anticipated. SAM performance? Inconclusive at best. The official answer? Denial. At an emergency briefing inside a steel-walled hall outside Moscow, a Soviet air defense marshal reviewed the figures and shook his head. He rejected the data outright. "The Vietnamese have miscalibrated their systems," he said. Another officer proposed that weather anomalies had skewed radar performance. Yet another claimed that American flight paths must have shifted beyond radar range despite clear tracking evidence to the contrary. No one wanted to say the obvious, that the B-52 seconds were flying straight into the heart of Soviet-designed airspace and surviving. Instead of acknowledging failure, Soviet leadership searched for convenient scapegoats. Defective missile batches, undertrained North Vietnamese operators, false intelligence. At one point, a technical commission even suggested that the Americans had developed a radar jamming method that disrupted missile fusing, an explanation for which no evidence existed. But each excuse raised deeper concerns. Because if the fault wasn't with the missile, and not with the operators, then what remained? The doctrine itself. A few dissident officers voiced what others feared. The entire Soviet saturation strategy might be obsolete against integrated air operations. Their warnings were not welcomed. Some were reassigned. Others were told to stop spreading defeatist interpretations. Doctrine, the generals believed, was not broken, it was being subverted by temporary conditions. Meanwhile, the B-52 seconds kept flying, every night, every wave, punching through the very system that had been sold to the Kremlin as foolproof. And back in Hanoi, the Soviet advisors began asking quieter questions off the record, in the shadowed corners of concrete bunkers. What if they've built a machine that wants to be targeted? Because if that were true, then the future didn't belong to missile walls. It belonged to whatever came next. When the first B-52 seconds fell to SAMs during the opening nights of Linebacker II, Soviet analysts believed their predictions were finally being validated. 3 bombers destroyed in one night. High-altitude targets. Radar-confirmed kills. The theory was clear. With enough pressure, the system would crack. They called it erosion by saturation. According to this belief, even heavily protected bomber streams couldn't survive repeated, coordinated missile salvos. The key was not eliminating the threat in a single blow, but wearing it down, turning the sky into an environment so dangerous that even the most hardened aircrew would buckle under attrition. For a brief moment, this theory seemed to work, but it was a mirage. By day 4, the Americans had adjusted. Tactics evolved overnight. Flight paths shifted subtly to exploit radar gaps. Jamming signals increased in complexity, introducing new frequency hopping methods. Chaff drops were staggered to mimic formations that didn't exist, ghost fleets of aluminum echoes. Even more dangerous was how the B-52 crews themselves responded. They didn't fracture under pressure. They flew tighter, coordinated more aggressively, relied more heavily on electronic support aircraft like EB-66 seconds and Wild Weasels. When a bomber went down, the next formation didn't panic, they analyzed the attack and adapted mid-air. Soviet observers watching from Hanoi saw the change before Moscow did. The Americans weren't wearing down. They were learning. But Moscow clung to the erosion model. They believed that another 2 or 3 nights of this tempo would break the U.S. strategic will. The saturation would accumulate. Eventually, even B-52 seconds would run out of luck. So the SAM launches continued. Night after night, dozens of sites went empty for the first time. Entire batteries burned through their missile reserves. Technical crews had to rotate fuses faster than they could be recalibrated. In desperation, operators started using single fire modes rather than the typical ripple fire setting, trying to conserve what they had left. And yet the results kept sliding in the wrong direction. Fewer kills, more successful bombing runs, bombers flying deeper and returning safely. What Moscow refused to see, and what some Soviet advisors began to fear, was that saturation theory wasn't flawed because of technical gaps. It was flawed because it treated war like a closed system. It assumed that enemy behavior would remain static, that the Americans would fly the same patterns, respond the same way, make the same mistakes. It never accounted for a feedback loop where every failure became data and every missile miss became fuel for adaptation. One Soviet radar officer, debriefing his unit after a failed interception, said it quietly but plainly, "They're not breaking, we are." He wasn't talking about equipment. He was talking about doctrine. With attrition by saturation failing, Soviet advisors reached for an older, more comforting belief that the B-52 seconds were only succeeding because of external enablers, specifically American electronic warfare. This second theory had deep roots in Soviet thinking. Ever since the Korean War, the Red Air Force had distrusted the electromagnetic spectrum as a battlefield. It was too unstable, too easily manipulated. They assumed any major failure in their systems, especially one this spectacular, must be the result of enemy jamming. So they reframed the Linebacker II disaster, not as a doctrinal failure, but as an EW problem. Reports were drafted alleging that B-52 formations were shielded by advanced jamming aircraft, operating outside SA-2 coverage. They claimed U.S. ECM pods were spoofing missile radars, sending false range data, or breaking lock seconds before impact. Some advisors even suggested that American spy satellites were feeding real-time SAM locations to the bombers, making countermeasures automatic and surgical. None of this was entirely false, but it was dangerously incomplete. Electronic warfare did play a critical role. The U.S. deployed EB-66 destroyers and specialized jamming platforms alongside BB-52 seconds. Chaff, frequency deception, and radar jamming were synchronized to disrupt target acquisition and tracking. But that wasn't the system's core strength. The B-52 seconds weren't just hiding. They were fighting smarter. The real revolution was in integration. Every American plane was part of a networked assault web. Electronic jammers supported pathfinders. Wild Weasels neutralized SAM sites ahead of bomber ingress, and reconnaissance aircraft relayed fresh data on radar activity. Each piece responded dynamically to enemy reactions. It wasn't chaos, it was orchestration. But Soviet theory couldn't process this kind of fluid, decentralized command. To them, jamming was a static shield, not a dynamic force. They believed if they could simply burn through the noise, they would see the targets and destroy them. This belief led to dangerous changes in Hanoi. SAM crews began launching missiles even without proper lock, hoping to scatter the B-52 seconds with blind fire. Others turned off radar to ambush the bombers when they thought jamming would be weakest. Still others tried short-range engagements, betting proximity would overcome confusion. The result? Wasted missiles, broken fire discipline, dozens of SAMs lost to futile, unaimed shots. Soviet colonels in Hanoi watched in horror as radar clutter filled their screens, and yet no kills followed. The assumption that jamming was the only reason the B-52 seconds were surviving had backfired. It had reduced sophisticated SAM networks into desperate, half-blind artillery units. One advisor finally admitted the unspoken. It's not just their machines, it's how they use them. The Americans had evolved the very concept of air assault. They didn't break the system with one weapon. They made every piece reinforce every other across air, space, and spectrum. Moscow, still clinging to a jamming-centric theory, couldn't see that. And the longer they stayed blind, the more those bombers kept getting through. In the war rooms of the Soviet Main Intelligence Directorate, GRU, the analysts had confidence in their numbers. They believed they knew the B-52's capabilities down to the rivet, the speed, the altitude, the bomb load, and the defensive weaknesses. They had spent years studying captured ECM pods, dissecting radio emissions, and reviewing satellite imagery of U.S. air bases from Guam to Thailand. And based on this intelligence, they were certain of one thing. The B-52 was vulnerable. Vulnerable to altitude-specific interception. Vulnerable to radar-guided SAMs. Vulnerable to psychological shock if confronted with high-intensity fire. But in the skies above Hanoi, those assumptions turned to dust. Soviet intelligence had failed not because it lacked information, but because it misread intent and evolution. The Americans had not just brought a bomber to the fight. They had brought a doctrine. This was not the lumbering, vulnerable B-52 of the 1,950 seconds. The Linebacker II campaign revealed a version of the aircraft that had quietly transformed over years of upgrades, internally hardened against electronic threats, equipped with tail radar warning receivers, updated countermeasures, and new strike coordination procedures. Each plane was a flying hub in a digital network that processed enemy radar signals, tracked launch patterns, and adapted tactics mid-flight. But Soviet intelligence had overlooked one critical variable: the human factor. They had never imagined that American crews could absorb data from previous strikes, integrate ECM with maneuvering, or reprogram strike packages on the fly. To Moscow's war planners, U.S. pilots were cogs in a machine, interchangeable and expendable. What they missed was how the U.S. had trained them to think like a system. The result? The SAM network was being defeated not by stealth, but by cognitive overmatch. Soviet advisors in Hanoi filed increasingly desperate reports. Strikes were anticipated, one wrote, but counteractions were not understood in time. Another noted that the same jamming pattern used on Night 1 had evolved by Night 4, rendering their frequency-shifting response obsolete. Even more troubling, the Americans seemed to be testing the limits of the SAM envelope. Some B-52 waves deliberately hugged the edge of known radar arcs, triggering early launches, then adjusting course to slip through missile gaps. Soviet analysts reviewing radar logs saw unmistakable evidence of real-time adaptation. By now, North Vietnamese crews were exhausted. Radar operators worked 16-hour shifts, firing on targets they couldn't verify, chasing echoes in a sky filled with ghosts. The burn-through rate of SA 2 seconds exceeded resupply. Batteries stood empty, while the bombers came again. Moscow's intelligence branch had failed to predict any of this. The massive U.S. electronic assault, the doctrinal layering, the psychological resilience, it had all been hidden behind the Cold War's most dangerous illusion, that yesterday's blueprint could win tomorrow's war. We knew their weapons, a Soviet general reportedly said in private, but we never knew what they were becoming. Har never knew what they were becoming. By the time the GRU began to rewrite its assessments, it was too late. The damage was done. The B-52 seconds had exposed a blind spot so massive that it reached from Hanoi's scorched earth all the way to the Kremlin. And the bombs were still falling. The world saw bombers. What the Soviets missed was the system. Linebacker II wasn't just an air campaign. It was the live debut of a new American way of war, a system so integrated, so layered, that it bent every assumption Soviet planners held about aerial combat. At the center were the B-52 seconds, each flying fortress laced with electronic countermeasures, radar warning receivers, and ECM pods. But they weren't acting alone. Every formation was supported by an invisible network of platforms, assets, and information loops operating in real time across the Southeast Asian theater. Wild Weasels flew in first, deliberately triggering SAM sites to reveal their positions. As those missiles launched, jamming aircraft like the EB-66 seconds swept in behind, flooding enemy radars with noise, breaking locks, and scrambling targeting data. Next came F-4 escorts, armed not just with missiles but with updated threat libraries from earlier missions. But the core of it wasn't firepower. It was fusion. Every sensor, every jammer, every bomb drop was part of a synchronized strike package. Communications, satellites, relayed changes instantly. Airborne command posts like Chrome Dome monitored target destruction from 20,000 feet, rerouting bombers based on unfolding results. Pilots received updates mid-mission. Routes were altered in real time to exploit radar gaps detected just minutes earlier. Soviet doctrine, rigid, centralized, pre-scripted, couldn't comprehend this level of fluidity. They had built a missile grid. The Americans built a thinking machine. Even their deception was deliberate. Decoy B-52 seconds simulated false bombing runs, drawing off SAM salvos. Entire waves were spaced to maximize psychological effect: first shock, then disorientation, then silence, followed by another wave from a different vector. Soviet advisors in Hanoi quickly realized they weren't fighting a bomber. They were fighting an ecosystem. In post-strike interviews, American pilots described relying less on orders and more on shared situational awareness. EW officers analyzed threat reactions across multiple nights and adjusted countermeasure programming on the fly. What looked like chaos from below was in fact patterned adaptation, a living campaign, not a scripted operation. The numbers told the rest of the story. Over 730 sorties flown. More than 15,000 tons of bombs dropped. Only 15 B-52 seconds lost, and even that was rapidly absorbed by the air machine's capacity to learn, shield, and press forward. Soviet generals reviewing these outcomes were shaken not just by the losses, but by the consistency of American success. This wasn't random. This was something engineered, a system built not around platforms, but problems. A force where everything talked, everything moved, everything fed back. The B-52 wasn't just surviving. It was the spearhead of an architecture that treated enemy doctrine as data, turned resistance into refinement, and adapted faster than any system the Soviets had ever imagined. One advisor put it simply: "We built machines to fight war. They built war that thinks." For a Soviet command rooted in iron logic, this was heresy. But as Hanoi burned, and their radars flickered uselessly over formations they couldn't kill, there was no denying the truth anymore. The Americans hadn't just defeated the SAM network, they had out-evolved it. The 26th of December 1972, the single most devastating airstrike in the Vietnam War. It began at 10:58 p.m. Over 120 B-52 bombers launched nearly simultaneously from Utapao and Andersen AFB, the sky over the Pacific and Thailand roaring with the thunder of engines that weighed more than 1 million pounds each. Codenamed the Christmas Raid, this night marked the apex of Operation Linebacker II and the moment the Soviet system shattered in real time. The targets: Hanoi, Haiphong, and the remaining logistical arteries connecting them. The mission: cripple North Vietnam's war-making capacity in one coordinated blow. On the ground, Soviet advisors braced for impact. They'd been promised reinforcements, restocked SAM batteries, and new jamming countermeasures from Moscow. None of them mattered, because the B-52 seconds had changed again. Instead of rigid approach patterns, the formations flew unpredictable S-curves. They varied altitude, modified ingress routes, and used previously untested radar corridors. EB-66 seconds saturated the spectrum, confusing radar operators by bouncing ghost echoes between multiple frequency bands. Meanwhile, F-4, Wild Weasels, lit up SAM sites with anti-radiation missiles, forcing them to shut down or die. Hanoi's air defenses, once touted as the densest outside Moscow, collapsed into reactive chaos. Some radar operators launched SAMs blindly, unable to get clean locks. Others held fire, convinced that what they were seeing wasn't real. In several documented cases, missiles were launched too late or too early, slamming into chaff clouds or detonating harmlessly in empty air. The worst came near Gia Lam. A full wave of B-52Ds dropped their payload with surgical precision, cratering rail yards, flattening warehouses, and igniting fuel depots in a sequence so tight it looked choreographed. Within seconds, secondary explosions ripped through entire neighborhoods of military infrastructure. Over 20 SAM sites engaged. Only one B-52 was confirmed downed. That was the night the myth died. For Soviet command, this wasn't just a military failure, it was an ideological humiliation. Their flagship air defense system, the SA-2, had been exported to over 30 countries, heralded as the ultimate counter to Western air power. Now it lay in pieces, its effectiveness debunked not by stealth, but by systemic adaptation. And worse, everyone was watching. Across the Eastern Bloc, military attachés received censored after-action reports. Cuban, East German, and Syrian officers quietly requested re-evaluations of their own air defense setups. In private, some questioned whether any Soviet-made SAM network could survive a similar assault. Back in Moscow, the humiliation ran deeper. Generals had built their careers on the invincibility of the Soviet air defense doctrine. Now, with every passing night of Linebacker II, they were watching that belief evaporate on television, in intelligence dispatches, and in intercepted American mission logs. What was supposed to be a Cold War deterrent had become a test range. The B-52 seconds hadn't just survived, they had dominated. One Soviet colonel in Hanoi, formerly a lecturer at the Zhukovsky Air Academy, summarized the disaster in his field report with chilling precision. Our theory treated war as a wall, they treated war as a path. And that path had led them right through the strongest Soviet defenses in Asia. Unstoppable, untouched, undeniable. When the final B-52 wave vanished over the Laotian border on the 29th of December, 1972, they didn't just leave destruction behind, they left a vacuum. A vacuum in confidence, a vacuum in doctrine, a vacuum in belief. Because Linebacker II had done more than demolish rail yards, power stations, and airfields, it had annihilated the ideological scaffolding that held up Soviet air defense strategy. For over a decade, Moscow had pushed a narrative that Soviet missile technology, radar systems, and centralized command structures made their allies impregnable to Western air power. North Vietnam had been the ultimate showcase real-world proof that the SA-2, when layered correctly, could deny the skies to even the most advanced bombers. But the American campaign tore that illusion apart in 11 days. Despite firing more than 1,200 SAMs, only 15 B-52 seconds were confirmed destroyed. Even accounting for fighter escorts, the overall loss rate hovered around 2%. In return, the Americans had leveled hardened military infrastructure and pushed North Vietnam to the negotiating table. This wasn't attrition warfare. It was strategic precision. Soviet doctrine had no answer. Not just tactically, but philosophically. The heart of the crisis was adaptation. The Americans had shown that war wasn't about mass alone, it was about iteration, integration, and real-time learning. They didn't win by having the best plane or the strongest missile. They won by creating a war machine that could evolve faster than it could be countered. The Soviet system, rigid, hierarchical, pre-planned, was helpless against that. The impact reverberated beyond Hanoi. Across Warsaw Pact countries, military planners began questioning the viability of Soviet export doctrine. If the B-52, an aircraft designed in the 1,950 seconds, could survive the full weight of Soviet air defense, then what chance did MiG-based intercept forces or outdated SAM grids have against the next generation of American platforms? In Moscow, high-level reviews quietly commenced. Some pushed for modernization, more mobile SAM systems, better electronic countermeasures, and decentralized command nodes. But others clung to the old orthodoxy, unwilling to admit that the American system hadn't just outflown them, it had outthought them. What Linebacker II exposed wasn't a tactical shortcoming. It was a civilizational vulnerability. A system built on control had been defeated by a system built on adaptation. A machine built for volume had been shattered by precision. And for the first time, Soviet military leadership had to stare into a future where technological superiority wasn't enough, where thinking faster, learning quicker, and integrating deeper mattered more than firepower alone. If they can do this with bombers, one GRU analyst warned, what will they do with fighters, with satellites, with drones? The nightmare had only just begun. Today, the B-52 still flies. 70 years after its first flight, the same bomber that broke the Soviet myth in Vietnam now carries precision-guided munitions, electronic warfare pods, and satellite-linked targeting. It cruises at high altitudes with modern avionics and digital battle maps, but the ghost of Linebacker II still lingers in every engine's roar. For Soviet strategists, those who survived the Cold War, the trauma never fully faded. The humiliation in Hanoi became a quiet benchmark. In classified war colleges, it was referred to not as a battle, but a systemic rupture. A failure not just of missile-to-plane matchups, but of worldview. Every new iteration of Soviet air defense, from the SA-6 to the S-300, was tested not just against aircraft, but against the memory of the B-52. Because they knew, The next time, it wouldn't just be a bomber. It would be an ecosystem, and they weren't wrong. What began over Hanoi has since evolved into the modern American doctrine of Joint All-Domain Command and Control, JADC. 2. A force-wide system that merges sensors, weapons, aircraft, satellites, and decision-makers into a single adaptive web. The seeds were planted in December 1972. The roots grew in the silence between the SAM launches, and the branches now stretch from orbit to every continent on Earth. Soviet command would not survive to see its full bloom. By the 1,980 seconds, their own systems began to fracture under the weight of obsolescence. By 1991, the Soviet Union was gone, its generals retired, its defense plans archived, its secrets declassified. But the B-52 flew on, and in its shadow, a warning that even the mightiest defense can be rendered blind if it refuses to evolve. Linebacker II is no longer taught just as an air campaign. It is studied as a doctrinal revolution, not a victory of steel, but a victory of systems thinking. And somewhere, high above the Pacific, a stratofortress still turns toward the horizon, older now, quieter perhaps, but carrying the echoes of those 11 nights when the future of warfare was written in fire across the skies of Hanoi.